As America made the shift in the late 1800s from a primarily agricultural nation to an industrial one, many changes occurred, some beneficial but also some awful. More Americans lived poverty-stricken lives in cities than ever before, and often had unsafe or disgusting living and working conditions. Then the Progressives came along in an era known as the Progressive Era. While lasting from the 1890s up until around the start of World War I, the effects of the Progressive Era are still felt today. Helped by the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, the Progressives had many goals. For the most part, they were focused on improving city life socially, politically, and economically. They were interested in democratic ideals and social justice in areas such as transportation, fire and police protection, lighting, sanitation, education, child labor, roads, and the regulation of the length of a workday. The progressive movement cut all barriers, those of race, religion, political, gender, and geographical. Muckrakers attempted to bring about change in these areas through writing about the shortcomings of big business and the other areas in need of improvement. They would write books and articles to reach out to the American people. And they were successful. The Progressives played a direct role in the ratification of three amendments: the 17th, which allowed for the direct election of senators, the 18th, which prohibited alcoholic beverages, and the 19th, which allowed women to vote. One other major area of improvement in the early 1900s was in food safety. Many improvements were made in this area. A book was written, acts were passed, and precedents would be set for the future. Which brings the question, to what extent was food safety improved during the Progressive Era? As America went from being agricultural to industrial, many things changed. One thing was the way Americans got their food. Gone were the ways of the early 1800s, in which Americans would grow their own food or purchase it locally. Through technological advancements and the move to cities, many Americans relied on improved transportation to get their food. Refrigerated train cars aided in this and transported meat and other perishable foods far distances to big cities and towns. Through industrialization, the meatpacking industry grew tremendously. Large meatpacking facilities operated large slaughterhouses in a few places, such as Kansas City and most famously Chicago. Corporations such as Armour, Wilson, and Swift tried to use the emerging industry to their advantage to maximize profit. And, in this attempt to make profit, to up the quantity of meat produced, they let the cleanliness and the quality of the meat drop drastically. Then, the already dirty meat would be transported on refrigerated train cars, which in many cases, as explored by Mary Engel Pennington, were not cold enough to keep the meat at all fresh. People would often get sick, and they simply did not know why, because they, in most cases, did not even know where their food came from. People were also misinformed about the contents of the drugs they were ingesting. Mislabeled containers and false advertising led to innocent drugs that contain harmful materials, such as heroin, cocaine, and opium. Many got addicted to these drugs after taking some misleading medicine. The Truth in Advertising movement was a different progressive era movement, which was closely related to food safety and would be solved with a similar act. Many people got sick from the poor treatment of meat at meatpacking facilities and of the poor transportation. One major incident was the embalmed beef scandal, which took place during the Spanish-American War in 1898. Though troops were scarce at the beginning of the war, a call for volunteers sent the original 28,000 up to 10 times that. This large jump made supplies thin, and the soldiers were forced to eat disgusting, tasteless, stringy beef. The generals believed the beef was defective, saying that it had an odor like an embalmed dead body. There is much controversy on whether or not the beef was actually tainted, and after the events of the coming years, the answer to the question was undoubtedly yes, the beef was tainted. This event and many others led people, for the first time, to question where their food was coming from. Upton Beale St. Clair Jr. played a crucial part in changing the flawed old system. St. Clair was born on September 20th, 1878, in Baltimore, and he moved to New York City in 1888. Bright and intelligent, he lived for the most part with his very poor family, but also occasionally with his very wealthy grandparents, and seeing both wealth extremes, he claims, turned him into a socialist. He wrote almost 100 books in his lifetime about a variety of topics. In 1904, St. Clair was commissioned by Fred Warren, editor of the socialist journal Appeal to Reason, to investigate the working conditions of the Chicago meatpacking industry and to write about his findings to be published in the newspaper. He went undercover, working in Packingtown for 7 weeks. St. Clair worked all day and listened to the stories of his co-workers at night. After the 7 weeks, St. Clair was horrified. He wrote about his experiences, and The Jungle, named for the condition in which many workers lived in, was published as a book in 1906. Sinclair's intentions were to expose the lack of sanitation, low wages, hazardous working conditions, and mediocre living conditions. The public, however, pulled a different meaning out of the book. The public was mostly concerned not with the working and living conditions of the workers, but with the quality of the food they were eating. People were now beginning to question the origin of the beef they were consuming. Sinclair himself stated that, "I aimed at the public's hearts, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." The passages themselves truly illustrate the gruesome nature of certain, but not all, sections of the book. On page 168 it is said, "There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip all over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over those piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together." Later on, in a similar section of the book, under the system of rigid economy which the packers enforced, there were some jobs that it paid to do once in a long time, and among these was the cleaning out of the waste barrels. Every spring they did it, and in the barrels would be dirt and rust and old nails and stale water, and cartload after cartload of it would be taken up and dumped into the hoppers with fresh meat and sent out to the public's breakfast. People were absolutely disgusted with the book, and, though not with Sinclair's intentions, pressured the federal government to make significant changes. Sinclair even met with a horrified Roosevelt, who sent a team to investigate the claims made in the book, but again missing Sinclair's main focus of workers' rights and focusing on just the cleanliness of the food the public was eating. Other people also played major roles in the change for safer food and drugs. Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley, the chief chemist in the Bureau of Chemistry, did a lot of research about the use of preservatives in food. He ran many experiments and found that preservatives were often used to cover up inferior products than what was being advertised. The writings of Samuel Hopkins Adams also led to increased public awareness about mislabeled drugs and even more public concern. And the government did listen to the public, and two major acts were passed the same year The Jungle was published. Both signed by Theodore Roosevelt on June 30th, 1906, the two acts had great long-term effects for the healthiness and safety of the American people. The first of the acts, and also lesser known, is titled the Federal Meat Inspection Act. This act establishes standards for meat regulation, giving the Secretary of Agriculture the power to inspect the meat and condemn any products that, according to the act, are unsound, unhealthful, unwholesome, or otherwise unfit for human food. The more widely known act, the Pure Food and Drug Act, also set regulations for consumable products. It is described within the act as an act for preventing the manufacture, sale, or transportation of adulterated or misbranded or poisonous or deleterious foods, drugs, medicines, and liquors, and for regulating traffic therein and for other purposes. This prohibition of tampered with or mislabeled foods in the U.S. extends to any food consisting of filthy or decomposing animal matter, poisonous food, foods with harmful coloring or flavoring, and foods tampered with to hide inferior goods. It put the Department of Agriculture in charge of this, of testing all food and drugs destined for human consumption. The act also outlaws mislabeled medicine, and requires all medicine bottles to contain a label with the percent of potentially harmful ingredients, such as stimulants or narcotics. In Theodore Roosevelt's State of the Union address in 1907, he states that, 2 years have not elapsed, and already it has become evident that the great benefit the law confers upon the public is accompanied by an equal benefit to the reputable packing establishments. The latter are better off under the law than they were without it. The benefit to interstate common carriers or business concerns from the legislation I advocate would be equally marked. The act worked to an extent. Some things were caught, as seen in these two specimens of contaminated ketchup bottles, and the report written by the Department of Agriculture stating the contents of the bottles. According to the report, the ketchup was adulterated in violation of the Pure Food and Drug Act of June 30th, 1906, because it consisted in whole or in part of a filthy, putrid, or decomposed vegetable substance. This is one instance in which the Pure Food and Drug Act caught something adulterated. However, these two acts, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, were all seen as beneficial by Roosevelt and many others, and while they did work in some cases, were in reality weak in the short term. Tampered food and misbranded drugs still found their way into stores and into the public's mouths. However, the acts were very significant for two reasons. First, they set the precedent for the fact that public safety and health is ensured by the federal government. The federal government was, unlike ever before, setting rules and regulations for health-related issues, and health and safety was something that the progressives were really after to reform. The other reason that the act was significant is that they both set an excellent foundation to being strengthened in the future. The Food and Drug Act in particular was strengthened numerous times. Perhaps the most noteworthy change was in 1938, when the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which replaced the 1906 Food and Drug Act, was passed. This also established the Food and Drug Administration, as well as adding on that cosmetics had to be safe to use. In the coming decades, there would be many more improvements, such as the Drug Amendments in 1962, the Medical Device Amendments in 1976, the Modernization Act in 1997, and the Prescription Drug Act in 2003. Through the work of many, America was transformed during the Progressive Era in its regulation of food and drug production. Before Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle and the federal government made any changes, the meatpacking industry was just another unregulated big business, most focused on making a profit. But through the work of Sinclair and of the federal government, changes were made. Production was regulated, and meat production became more sanitary, and fewer mislabeled drugs were being released. Though somewhat weak at the time, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act set the precedent for the federal government to provide for the health and well-being of the public, and the act served as a great foundation for future amendments. Though today the food and drug industry is still not perfect, it is much better than it was 100 years ago.